I'd like to invite you up to this TEDx stage. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start things off by asking you to make a personal reflection. I'd like each of you, if you could, to think about a pet peeve that you have about language. Maybe it's something that you hear misused or mispronounced, something that kids say these days, a bit of slang you just can't stand. Whatever it is, I'm sure each of you can think of something that you hear in the speech of others that you judge negatively. And one thing that's often judged negatively is elements of a language that are currently changing. That language's change is an undeniable fact. We all know very well that the speech of each young generation develops its own idiosyncrasies of slang and pronunciation, and that these are usually poorly received by older and more educated speakers. But in each generation, some of these changes catch on for good, and cumulatively over 1,000 years, the results are drastic, especially when a language also changes by interacting with neighboring languages. Let's take a familiar example. This is the Lord's Prayer in English, 11th century English. Now, you might be able to recognize 2 or 3 words that resemble their modern counterparts in this 20th century version, but for the most part, it's completely unintelligible to us today. If you were to hear it as it was spoken 1,000 years ago, you'd understand even less of it. For many decades, historical linguists, people who study this type of change in language, thought that we couldn't see it happening in real time. It was long held that it was like watching a tray of ice melt on your kitchen counter. At any given moment, you can't see anything happening. There's nothing going on. It's only if you leave for an hour and come back that the difference between your ice cube of Old English and your modern English puddle becomes obvious. The discipline of sociolinguistics, though, has proven that we can indeed observe language change happening in immediate real time, giving us profound insight into the mechanisms of how language changes and how we negotiate our personal and social identities in the context of that change. With the right methods, we can even observe a drastic change in a language reaching completion within a single generation. So I'm going to talk about a historical example before turning to my own research in exactly this area. Later intermediate stages of English are easier to understand for us than this Old English here, but they're still very different from ours. And I'm going to take verb placement as an example. A sentence like, I take quickly a bath, sounds wrong to us, but to an Englishman 600 years ago, it was totally okay. Now, to a syntactician, a sentence like that looks something like this. Just bear with me on the details, just trust me, because few things are less stimulating than introductory syntax. Really, honestly. But all we need to worry about are the verb and inflection spots on this graph. In every language, the main verb in a sentence starts its life in the verb spot. And in Middle English, like many modern languages, including French, if there's nothing in the inflection branch, it just jumps right on up there and takes its place. And of course, you can't tell it's moved unless it moves around something else, like an adverb, say, quickly. So now in the verb raises, we get I take quickly a bath, which is not so good for us, but for Chaucer, it was totally fine. And more importantly, for his children learning English at the time, they would have subconsciously learned from this that it was okay to raise verbs just like that. That inflection spot, though, is where we put auxiliary verbs like can, will, should, and do. So if we have do there, then the verb can't raise. In the early modern English period, it became very fashionable to put do's in all over the place. How do you do? I do declare that I do very well, and so on. The result was that verbs were raised so rarely that children learning English at the time didn't have any evidence that it was okay to raise them. In a single generation, the rule for verb raising was reversed, and modern English syntax changed forever. With that out of the way, we can turn to a contemporary change, one that all of us in this room probably hear or even use daily. It might be the biggest change we've seen in English in a very long time. And I'm talking about like. Like has had a bad rap from the very beginning. People typically think of it as a useless space filler and generally find it pretty annoying. Fascinated linguists, on the other hand, immediately set to work to find out what it meant and why people were saying it. Now, this might shock you, but the consensus over the years has generally been that like is developing a new and legitimate grammatical function. It's what we call a focus particle. It takes a constituent of a sentence, that's a defined unit like a noun phrase or a verb phrase that we just saw in the syntax tree, and highlights it as important for listeners' benefit. Many languages around the world have focus particles, and in those languages, they're no big deal. It's just, in English, we're only getting U-stars because it's pretty new. In the early 80s, though, linguists noticed yet another new use for like, placing it next to the verb to be to indicate what somebody said or what you thought to yourself during a narrative. We call this use the be-like quotative. I'm going to share some examples of it with you from the interviews I conducted for my research. You'll notice that it can be used in the infinitive.
Just easier to be like, well, I have the rest of the days off.
In the past or present or any verb tense.
I look back on high school and I'm like, that actually was really, really great.
Amy's like, no, you can't be mean to my friend.
And I was like, I have to be, I'm sorry.
Or with any modal or auxiliary verb.
They got in a fight,
Okay.
and they needed time to cool down. And whereas any other couple would be like, I need to cool down. They break up.
Now, be like is reaching the end of a fast and overwhelming domination of the quotative system in English worldwide. It's even spread into other languages, exclicam in French and estado como in Spanish. I would wager that any native English speaker in this room, under perhaps 35, probably uses it every single day. Professor Sally Tagliamonte at the University of Toronto did in-depth studies on the be like quotative in 1999 in Ottawa and 2004 in Toronto. Undergraduate researchers did interviews with 44 youths aged 10 to 19 to assemble the Toronto Youth English Corpus. They talked to close friends and relatives about the type of thing that they would normally discuss on a day-to-day basis. Problems with boyfriends and girlfriends, trouble with parents, and tons of healthy gossip. The result was 500,000 words of transcribed speech, including over 2,000 instances of quotation. Again, it's important to note that this is informal, casual vernacular talk, the way that people really speak when they're emotionally involved in a conversation with intimates. Now, a couple questions interested me at the outset of my research, which is a follow-up to Tagliamonte's work. The first is, how do young Torontonians change their use of and the subtle nuances of meaning around be like while they enter into adulthood? And secondly, how small of a time frame can we look at to see these changes happening? To answer the question, I duplicated Tagliamonte's work using speakers born in the same year as the 15 and 16-year-olds that she studied. Like her speakers, they're all born and raised in Toronto their entire lives and come from somewhat middle-class backgrounds, so the samples line up very well. I assembled my corpus by transcribing 73,000 words of interview speech with 10 informants. And even with a small sample like this, some very significant and startling conclusions become obvious, especially when you're using that real speech, real talk, the way people talk when they're comfortable and around friends. Let's look at some of what I found. The most obvious result is that be like is still increasing rapidly in use. I'll show you the trend. Here's some data from a similar study in Ottawa in 1995. You can see be like on the left accounts for a little over 10% of quotations, and say is the most common verb. Here's the data from the Toronto Youth English Corpus in 2003. You can see be like has increased drastically to 56%. And finally, the results from my work last fall in 2008 in blue, where be like accounts for almost 100% of all quotations. It's now the default quotative verb in all instances of constructed dialogue for these young speakers, whereas the standards have largely disappeared. This doesn't tell us anything, though, about how a change like this spreads through a society. So to do that, let's zoom in on my sample. Here are the application percentages for each of my speakers, ranging from 75 to 92%. Again, it shows us that this change is nearing completion, but it doesn't show us who's the real agent of the change. So to do that, I'm going to do something very simple. I'm going to shade all of the bars representing the female speakers red. Let's let that sink in for a second. I'm also going to share here are the application percentages for each sex. To you statisticians out there, that result is pretty significant because the samples don't overlap. You could actually read a transcript of one of these interviews and determine the sex of the speaker by counting how many times out of 10 they say be like instead of say or think. Now, this type of revelation establishes that studying language change can tell us as much about a society and about personal identity as it can about language itself. We all largely subconsciously latch onto certain features of a language to express ourselves and using certain bits of slang or pronunciation to show people who we think we are in society. But female-led language changes in particular have one other unique advantage that increases their chances of long-term permanency. It's not difficult to imagine that in 5 or 10 years, these female speakers are going to be the primary caregivers for children of their own. And those children, male and female alike, will be acquiring the use of be like right from the cradle. Like I mentioned in the syntax example earlier, this type of generational transfer essentially seals the deal for a change in a language. So with this in mind, I predict that be like is here to stay, and we're going to see both sexes in the next couple of generations. This type of impetus has, I hope, convinced you that language change is unavoidable. The question then becomes, what do we do with it? We usually choose to view it negatively. We complain to our friends, we write letters to the editor, we correct the speech of our children just as our older relatives once corrected our speech. We could change things up a little bit and maybe simply accept it, let it run its course quietly, not paying it much heed. But finally, there's one other option. We could choose to embrace it. We could choose to embrace it for all of its novel poetic richness, for all of its fresh possibilities of expression. We could choose to embrace it for the universal and infinite beauty and creativity that innovations in a language can bring us. That's the message, and that's the idea that I'd like to spread today, because there will always, always be new talk for tomorrow. Thank you very much.